I'm going over this morning research updates, and this is not going to encompass all the research in the United States. This is going to look at the programs that we're involved with here. So certainly if you have questions about other trials that you may have heard of, Dr. Fisher and the group up in the Centers for Lung and Breathing, where he's centered, are actively looking to be participating in national trials. And so again, we're going to go over the ones that are kind of active here, but there's active trials looking at skin involvement, Raynaud's and digital ulcers, interstitial lung disease, and pulmonary hypertension. And we have a couple of examples of those as well. This is pretty informal, so if you guys need to stop me at any time or if you have questions, let me know. So one of the first studies that I'll kind of mention is that we're going to be involved in what's called Scleroderma Lung Study 3. And it'll be enrolling probably in early 2018. This is a national center study. And essentially, you know, Scleroderma Lung Study 3 means there was a 1 and 2. So 1 and 2, we learned from Scleroderma Study 1, it was that Cytoxan was a viable option or treatment for interstitial lung disease. And then from Scleroderma Lung Study 2, we learned that mycophenolate or Celcept was an equivalent strategy, and it's much less toxic. And these studies were really designed to look at folks who have scleroderma with interstitial lung disease involvement. This third study is going to look at whether adding an antifibrotic agent, so pirfenidone is FDA approved for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, and the question is whether adding that to standard therapy is going to be beneficial for folks with scleroderma lung disease. And so when I say adding it, people can be, the trial is designed to look at background therapy of Celcept in one arm versus Celcept plus an antifibrotic agent to see if adding an antifibrotic gives additional benefit. So we already know that Celcept or mycophenolate has a advantage over placebo or no treatment for scleroderma lung disease. But the question is whether an antifibrotic would be helpful as well. And so again, I don't want to go through, there's a lot of details in any of these studies. There's what they call inclusion criteria, meaning is a particular person a good candidate for this, and there's exclusion criteria, meaning if you were on certain medications, you might not be eligible for the trial. But I'm not going to go through all those, but that's stuff that if you guys have questions, either I can hopefully answer, although since I'm subbing for Dr. Fisher, I may not know all the answers. But Mallory Crow-Adams is in the back. Maybe she's raising her hand there in the back row. She works with Dr. Fisher in terms of research coordination in our research program. And so we might be able to answer questions or at least send information to you. So this is going to be an 18-month trial. And again, it's in treatment-naive patients. So this would be new folks or folks with scleroderma who've not yet been on therapy. And they do that because they don't want to mix effects that you may have, or benefits that you may have seen from immune suppression that you're already on versus what they're studying. So it's people that aren't treated. And then again, half go on just the mycophenolate and half get randomized to pirfenidone. And then they're going to study outcomes that are mostly breathing related, but they will collect data on skin, which will be informative for the treatment of skin disease as well. The second study is a pure skin study. So this is a little bit unique for us here at the university. Our focus really, because of our association with a great pulmonary group, has been primarily in interstitial lung disease and in pulmonary hypertension. But we're doing a drug study through a pharmaceutical company named Corbus, which is a skin primary study, so looking at skin involvement with scleroderma as the primary endpoint. And it's looking at lenabazum, which is actually a cannabinoid receptor agonist. And so you heard me correct. It's a cannabinoid receptor agonist. So cannabinoids are some of the endpoints or activity in marijuana. And this is not just a pain study. There's some thought that cannabinoid receptors may be involved immunologically. And so there's actually phase 2. So drug studies kind of go through 4 phases. And there's a phase 2 trial that showed some promising potential benefits of this medication in skin involvement. And so now they're planning to do a larger phase 3 study, which will give us more information about whether there's actually benefit of this. It is a controlled one substance. Dr. Fisher has applied for a license so that he can actually prescribe that medication, because you have to have a certain registration to be able to prescribe it. But it's looking at whether it will improve skin involvement. So I'll go through this one because it's a little bit unique. Nationally, they're looking for 230 subjects. So certainly here we would try to enroll a certain percentage of that. The duration of the study is 1 year. Cindy, is the handout? Maybe she's not here. I think are the handouts you guys have this data in it, correct? Is that true, or am I? Okay, good. So if I blow through things, I don't want you guys to feel like you don't have something in front of you, but I want to make sure there's time for everyone else. So it's a 1-year trial. There's certain things you can't be on, and again, the reason why to have you off those medications is because they don't want to have you on something like Cytoxin and then not know whether the study drug or the Cytoxin is having benefit. So people would have to be off those medications. You could have received them in the past, you just can't be on them at the time of the study. So that's the skin one. So far we talked about Scleroderma lung study 3, which is an ILD trial. There is the skin trial with a cannabinoid agonist. And then there's a number of pulmonary hypertension trials. This one here, this ASC01, is a scleroderma-specific study. So it's looking at rituximab, which is a B-cell depleter, and asking the question of whether that is beneficial in pulmonary hypertension. We're trying to make a big push. This is a trial that's been going on for some time, but we need extra enrollment, so it's one that we're actively trying to find folks with scleroderma and pulmonary hypertension with the question of whether rituximab adds benefit. So currently, right now, we know that vasodilator therapy, so medications that help lower pulmonary pressures, is effective, but we're not sure about whether immune suppression is helpful. So this study is trying to answer that question. I have a bunch of other studies listed here. I'm not going to go through them because these are not, in your handout you'll see, they're not necessarily scleroderma-specific studies. They're just pulmonary hypertension studies. You can be enrolled in them as a scleroderma patient, but they're not necessarily designed just for folks with scleroderma. Some of these are, most of the ones on this slide, at least all of them on this slide, are all interventional trials, meaning it's a study drug with a question of can that make pulmonary hypertension better. On this slide, again, most of these, what you'll see is that most of these are interventional trials. The top one is a biobank, so that's a registry. So again, I think that we like to be able to offer all types of research here, and obviously therapeutic trials are important to understand more about what works and what doesn't work for an illness, but some folks don't want to be involved in a drug trial because that's kind of a little bit frightening. So we do have some registry studies that I'll go over in the next slide as well. And registry studies are essentially collecting blood work or other types of data so we can just understand more about kind of the pathology or how the disease develops and how the disease progresses, because that will hopefully lead to more therapeutic interventions in the future. So the two big registries that we're involved with now is one is an interstitial lung disease registry that's run by Dr. Joyce Lee. She's a pulmonologist who joined us a year and a half or maybe 2 years ago, and she's from UCSF. So Joyce is involved with the Scleroderma Foundation, and this is an ILD study that's not just scleroderma, but all interstitial lung diseases, and so a portion of which have scleroderma. So again, this is a non-interventional for those folks that might be interested in research but don't want to receive potentially a study drug. It's something to talk about with your doc. And then there's a pulmonary hypertension repository as well that's run by Dr. Todd Bull, who's on our Scleroderma Medical Advisory Board as well. And that's been going for over 10 years. It has close to 1,000 people enrolled, of which nearly 20% have scleroderma. So again, if you're interested more in learning about any of the trials that we're doing here, or if you're questioning about a trial that you heard about online and wondering if the university might offer that in the future, we'd welcome any questions. I left Mallory's contact information here too. Again, she helps head up studies through Dr. Fisher and the Centers for Lung and Breathing. And then we left a little bit of time at the end. I think I'm going to have Dr. Moore come up, and we have a couple of options for studies that are run at Children's as well in terms of for the pediatric population with scleroderma. So I don't know, I've never introduced Katie before. Katie Moore is a doc over at Children's Hospital. She's been here, how many years have you been here, Katie?
Just about 2.
About 2 years, okay. She comes to us originally trained out here for residency, did fellowship training at University of Washington, and has a interest in scleroderma and all things pediatric rheumatology. All right, thanks.
So hi, yes, I'm Dr. Katie Moore. I'm over at Children's, and I'm currently the kind of research coordinator for our clinical studies over there in the department as well. When I was in Washington doing my fellowship training, I also did additional training in clinical epidemiology at University of Washington, so have a particular interest in clinical research. And so kind of from the pediatric standpoint, because yes, kids get scleroderma too, we really have a lot of interest in how we can actually help these patients. The problem, though, I mean, this obviously exists with adult scleroderma, but in pediatrics in particular, the difficulty studying these illnesses is that the diseases are rare. Pediatric rheumatologists are rare. That map, I don't know how well it's projecting. Basically, the bottom line is there's not many of us. And funding is also rare, but at the same time, we really need more than just, anecdotal reports of what works and doesn't work. So the biggest question is, how do we actually enroll enough people in these studies to get some meaningful answers? And the lessons that we actually learned came from kind of watching over time what happened with childhood cancers, and in particular with childhood leukemias. Back in the 1950s, it was pretty much a death sentence to be diagnosed with a childhood leukemia, whereas now it's actually considered more of a chronic illness that is curable more than 90 to 95% of the time. And in kind of what the kind of graph up there shows is that each of the bars at the bottom are various national registry databases that have kind of come along over time. And the more and more of these registries that have been developed, the goal is every child, no matter what center they show up to in the United States, is automatically enrolled in an ongoing database and is put on a trial to say, does their medication work better than the standard of care, and really kind of approach it in a very cookie-cutter approach to get some great answers. And more over time, that's led to just remarkable breakthroughs in treatment and really discerning what is the best way to treat these kids. And so in a rheumatology perspective, we actually kind of as a group of pediatric rheumatologists kind of came together and said, what can we kind of learn from this model? And out of that was born this organization referred to as CARA, which stands for the Childhood Arthritis and Rheumatology Research Alliance. And essentially, it's a network of virtually every pediatric rheumatology center in North America, including Canada and Mexico, as well as the United States, so that the goal is that every new pediatric rheumatology diagnosis, whether it's lupus, juvenile arthritis, scleroderma, gets enrolled into a long-term longitudinal database to be followed over time and compared, does this med versus that med work. It's also then a great repository for drug companies and drug studies down the road to come back and have a kind of centralized location of all of this data. And any researcher in the United States is then allowed to apply to CARA for that data to kind of study on their own. And that also ensures that since there's only 200 some odd pediatric rheumatologists, that you don't have 3 people working on the exact same project, that it helps actually kind of make sure that people are doing novel research to get some good answers, and allows us to pull data from across all of North America, not just any one single study, single center. And through all of this, we're able to collect again, Jason had mentioned biobanks, and so we can look at markers in the blood that can maybe help predict how courses progress over time, how aggressive do we need to be when these kids show up, and ultimately develop what we call consensus treatment plans. And this is just a map of the CARA sites. And what these consensus treatment plans are is they are developed through these things called Delphi Surveys, which basically is just a very formalized, structured survey of experts across the country in terms of what people think are maybe the leading top ways to treat these illnesses, and then kind of pare it down to a kind of more manageable number of treatment options that we can then compare scientifically. And at every single visit that these kids come to, more data gets added to that. We collect samples of blood, again, looking for biomarkers, and most importantly, we were able to compare outcomes. And this is just an example. This kind of came out a couple of years ago. The Scleroderma treatment plan. This was for localized scleroderma, which is when most often in kids, when they get the localized form, it's kind of a band of sclerotic skin that kind of extends in a line up typically one side of the body. For some kids, it can be in multiple sites. But basically what those first two pie charts show is that, if you asked all the pediatric rheumatologists in the United States, hey, how do you treat localized scleroderma? Everyone pretty much said steroids and methotrexate. The question was, how much steroids? Do you give it IV? Do you give it oral? What's the dose? Is it per kilo? Is it per meter squared? And same thing for methotrexate. And every single little color on those wheels was an answer to that. So basically the bottom line is everyone was kind of doing their own thing, and we didn't have a very standardized way to approach that. And through the research that we were able to do, we kind of narrowed it down to one single agreed upon dose of methotrexate and 3 different options for steroids depending upon how sick these kids were at presentation, and then are able to kind of compare and contrast those more meaningful kind of limited number of options, and has really, again, just streamlined the process so that regardless of what scleroderma center you end up at, chances are you'll be treated in a very similar way. And so I think I left out one slide accidentally when I was copying them over. We have actually an upcoming one for systemic sclerosis in kids. It is just rolling out next month. It's funded mostly through CARA, but also through a really generous grant from the Scleroderma Foundation. I'm the PI over at Children's for it. And basically we're collecting baseline blood samples and baseline and every single visit kind of data on these kids to really try to get some answers and develop a more streamlined approach to how we treat our systemic scleroderma patients, since they definitely are the more sick population that we take care of, and we would love to have some answers to help them keep being the kids that they are. But that's it.
Questions?
Oh, yeah. About 2% of them had onset under the age of 10. And various estimates say between kind of 3 and 9% had onset between age 10 and age 16. So it's the minority, but it's, I kind of feel like there's statistics, but then when something happens to you, statistics sort of fly out the window, right? It's 0% or 100%. It happens or it doesn't. Yeah. In peds, it does. I can pass it on. I actually am working. I have a really great relationship with one of the pediatric rheumatologists in Italy who is studying juvenile systemic sclerosis, and we're trying to find ways to kind of combine our databases. It gets into all sorts of sort of red tape political stuff in terms of data ownership and whatnot, but we're trying to find ways to make red tape go away for the best interest of patients.